He's an environmentalist and former government advisor on climate change. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, Julia.
Thanks so much for joining us, Tom. Let's talk first of all about the damage that's been done to these homes. Many of these homes are in areas which have been flooded time immemorial, have been flooded very recently, in the recent years and recent decades, been promised works to protect them from flooding. In some cases, it's not actually been carried out, and they've been left, I would say, the exact opposite of high and dry, low and wet as a result of those failures. Who do you point the finger at in terms of the fact that there are so many families right now, thousands of families, whose homes have been damaged yet again?
Well, there are three people in a sense. There's the Environment Agency, which clearly, as we've seen, as again with river pollution, has really not been doing as well as it used to do at maintaining people from all kinds of environmental damage. So I think there's a problem there with whether the Environment Agency is paying enough attention and actually devoting the resources correctly to the problems. I think it's clearly been limited to some extent by the government, which has constrained its funding quite a lot recently. And so the money, one, hasn't been allocated enough, and two, when it has been allocated, the agency isn't getting it spent fast enough. So I think those are the problems. And then the third reason is the weather is actually getting worse. It's exactly what the scientists have told us would happen with climate change. We get more extremes of the weather, and we're simply not, as it were, doing enough to prepare for and anticipate that.
We are having some wetter winters, but also warmer summers. I'm personally prepared to have that trade-off. I think that's a rather good trade-off, having lived in a country that was wet in the summer as well for many years of my childhood. I think a lot of people would. But you say the Environment Agency, look, they've had their funding, curtailed. But again, there was 300 million quid of their funding left, which was being promised for various flood prevention works, which wasn't used. That's just an abject failing.
No, I agree with you about that. I think the Environment Agency has become a less effective, over the recent years, become a much less effective protector of our environment. And we really need to be thinking about that. But, one of the things that I think is hard for people to grasp, it might be nice to get warmer summers, but if you get winter winters like this, it means you put food prices up, because this has a really bad impact on our own ability to grow food here, as you've got these flooded fields will now make food prices go up in the summer. And that's the problem with climate change. It pushes extremes. So you get wetter weather in the weather, you get more wet weather and you get more dry weather. Those droughts, by the way, are partly why the price of tomatoes went up so much in recent months, because of droughts in Spain during last year.
Yes, but
so
droughts have happened before. You know perfectly well the weather changes due to other factors other than climate change. It actually happens, El Nino and La Nina have far more impact in terms of
Julia, the weather does change all the time. You're quite right about that. The climate doesn't change all the time. The climate changes on very long periods. And what we're seeing now is not simply a change in the weather, it's a change in the climate.
Yeah, well, the question is whether man is responsible for it, whether man is actually able to do anything about it.
I don't think that's a question, Julia.
Well, I know you think that. I think an awful lot of people are questioning that these days.
Well, they might, but it's only because you keep raising a question when the whole of the scientific community says this is caused by what we're doing.
I keep having people. Are you going to quote 97% or 99% of scientists? Again, both totally debunked stats that have been read. No, the whole of the scientific community does not accept that. There are big question marks still about whether man has any meaningful role in it, whether we can do anything about it, and whether we should do anything about it. Because actually, we can deal with things like flooding. Bearing in mind, most of Amsterdam. Amsterdam Airport is basically built in the sea. They were able to raise it. Huge amounts of Holland would be under the water if it wasn't for the fact of flood defences. Man is able to make technological changes to improve, our land and our safety. And we see far fewer people, 99% fall in people dying as a result of climate, extreme weather. We're able to deal with it. I'm just thinking that realistically, is it a problem we need to deal with? Isn't it better that we, for instance, don't build on floodplains, we dredge rivers, we provide the actual flood defences that would make a difference? Whenever you look at these places, they've been flooded and everyone goes, climate change, climate change. You look through, reports in, local papers in these areas for the last, 100 years. They've been having this. This has always happened.
No, it hasn't always happened, Julie. That's quite wrong. What has happened is some of these events have happened sometimes. What's happening now, and
Yeah,
the
so it's
people
always happened.
all over the country are experiencing it, is it's happening all the time, year after year, and it's getting more and more. And that's a fault of climate change. And you may not believe the science,
it's a fault of
but
failure.
most people in this
No, it's a
country are
failure to dredge
experiencing the
rivers, and
fact
it's
that
a
the
failure
science
to
is
carry out
correct.
all of those works.
Look, well, we should certainly carry out more work to adapt. I completely agree with you about that. We'd be much better off if the government actually, instead of giving people tax cuts, actually invested that money in improving our infrastructure to cope with these changes. So you're quite right about that. But that doesn't remove the problem. And you don't want to deal with a problem. What do you adapt to? If the problem is getting worse year on year, you don't know how much adaptation to do. So you're just going to find yourself year on year trying harder and failing, and that's not a very good way to proceed.
No, you wouldn't necessarily be failing. We don't try very hard, as you know. The costs of flood defences for low-lying buildings and towns would be far cheaper than the costs of, this mad dash to net zero, basically completely trashing our economy, making energy unreliable and intermittent and hugely expensive. It would make far, far more sense for us to spend that money on flood defences and any other measures if that were necessary, rather than the move to net zero, which will basically completely destroy our economy.
Julia, you're quite wrong about that. You're reading the wrong newspapers, I can tell. The fact of the matter is, if you want to get people's energy bills down, you invest in insulating their houses. That will actually lower people's bills, and it will deal with climate change.
Okay, hold on a second. Insulating people's houses is definitely a good thing. However, that doesn't create energy.
Well, I didn't say to create energy.
But that doesn't solve the problem, does it?
That's a way of getting bills down, but you didn't let me get on to telling you how you can create energy. We're spending £500 million a year switching off cheap wind power because we haven't invested in building the grid to get that power to where it's needed. That would be a very sensible thing to be spending money on. I agree with that completely. The idea that renewables are more expensive than fossil fuels, simply wrong. It's not true anymore.
That's why they have to be subsidised. But the point about renewable fuels like wind and like solar, and again, I'm sure my entire audience can say this with me, is that they need to have backup for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, which is quite long periods of time, not just for a couple of hours overnight. It's happening, the wind doesn't blow seriously enough, like a month at a time. We don't have the battery storage. That technology doesn't exist at the current time to store enough energy from those renewable energy, in which case you have to have backup. And if you're going to talk about the cost of wind and solar, you have to include in that the cost of gas storage stations, nuclear power stations, which, by the way, we still don't have enough of and are about to have fewer of. The cost of renewables also has to include the cost of the backup.
And it does.
It doesn't.
Exactly do. It does include that cost. It's part of what's called the service charge.
That's why people like you say it's so much cheaper.
No, it's not why I say it's so much cheaper. It's so much cheaper because it is actually cheaper. That's the reality of that. And what's more, if you want to put energy bills up, the best way you could possibly do that is to build more nuclear power stations, because they really are the most expensive way.
They're 100% reliable.
Yes. Well, actually, it's not 100% reliable. You want to really look at the figures put out every year by the Office for Nuclear Regulation. It's not 100% reliable. It's more reliable than some other things. That's absolutely true, but it's not 100% reliable. And what you need to do is to think very hard about how do you get people's bills down and keep the climate safe at the same time. And actually, all the things you want to do to get bills down will help you keep the climate safe.
All right, Tom. Thank you. It's great to talk to you. That's Tom Burke. Appreciate that.